Hi, welcome to More Up North. I'm Shannyn Moore, and I'm really glad you're joining us tonight. Last week, I had Rick Sinnen on, and we talked about this boondoggle that is the Moose Federation moving four calves, I think it was, for $1.3 million. And there seems to be a whole lot of other issues going on as well with our Alaska wildlife. So we thought we'd pull together a panel, an interview, and sort of talk about just how egregious it's gotten. It's kind of time for Alaskans to wake up and start actually standing up for our wildlife. I know. And running if they chase you. Actually, don't do that. Play dead. That's what you're supposed to do. We'll be back. That's why we have experts here. So thanks for joining us. We'll be right back with More Up North. Woo! Welcome back to More Up North. I'm thrilled to have here the Conservation Director for the Alaska Center of the Environment. Please welcome Valerie Conner. I feel like, and I don't know if other Alaskans feel this way, but it feels to me like we've been having this conversation about, do we shoot things out of planes, what's sportsmanship, what's hunting, what's just killing stuff, for a long time. I mean, Sarah Palin kind of brought it to light a little bit because it became a national joke of like, oh, people in Alaska, they shoot things out of airplanes. And I was like, yeah, it's really gross. You've been working on this for a while. Can you talk a little bit about, well, first of all, Alaskans voted continually to ban aerial wolf hunting for a long time. Why did they do that?
Because they didn't like the idea of shooting animals from airplanes.
Well, and isn't it true that there were really effective boycotts, I think, that were arranged by those, bunny huggers down south or whoever, well, I think Don Young calls them waffle stompers, which are a great kind of shoe, and I loved wearing them as a kid. But they really organized against this policy.
They did, and it actually turned the policy around at that time. They backed off. I think it was Wally Hickel decided, oh, maybe we shouldn't do this. It's not very popular, and it's still not very popular. And especially now that we're going to be shooting bears from airplanes, it just ups the ante even more so. And this was done without any kind of public vetting, Shannyn. I mean, this happened at the end of one of the meetings. The Board of Game changed regulation and passed a proposal, and people didn't really know. They didn't see it coming. People didn't have a chance to weigh in on whether this is an acceptable method of killing animals or not.
What would be an acceptable way to do it?
Well, I think you need to use science, for one. We don't just go blasting things out of airplanes and helicopters. Basically, what we're asking is for a balanced scientific approach to wildlife management. And how we ever got to this point where 7 people, all of a similar persuasion, are making all of the decisions on how our wildlife is managed, I don't know, but the system is obviously broken, and we need to fix it, all of us.
It would seem to me that in the state of Alaska, we have so many different users of our wildlife, and this is a resource. This is something owned by all of us. We have people that shoot them with cameras. We have tourism, huge tourism. In fact, usually when you see postcards from Alaska, they're not of the pipeline. They're of some bear, wolf, or porcupine, or some moose, or part of our wildlife. That Board of Game right now is pretty much one user group represented, correct?
Yes, it is.
Is there anybody on there that's like not insane? I'm sorry, that seemed insensitive. Is there anyone on that board that doesn't, that couldn't get this fixed with a Viagra prescription, perhaps, whatever their problem is? Oh, that seemed insensitive too. Whatever. Shoot me out of an airplane.
Shannyn, there are 7 members of the board. They're all appointed by the governor, and they're all from one single user group.
Right.
So no one from the tourism industries is represented. Nobody from wildlife viewing industries represented.
Subsistence?
Nobody from subsistence views are represented. So it's really, our wildlife has been co-opted. And like I said before, 7 people are making these decisions. Now, is that right? I mean, really?
No, it's not. That was the easiest question all night, I'm pretty sure. No, but what's interesting to me is like, it's really a systemic problem. I mean, I've gone to Board of Game meetings. I've gone when they were like voting in the council. There's a guy there who says things like, oh, yeah, well, I was a sex offender, but that was a long time ago. She was 16. She looked like she was 20. I mean, Steve Flory, he's explaining this to me, wanting me to vote for him, that it wasn't a big deal. He was her boss at ADN.
Yeah.
He's one of the people who's on an advisory. That's an acceptable person. He's not really even good at making decisions for his own life or other people's 16-year-olds. But we've got Parnell, we've had Palin, we've had Frank Murkowski, so they've got this loaded board. They put in Corey Rossi, who, you know, was kind of one of these guys that should have worn a helmet. He did not get through school. I think they said he had like 30 college credits in biology from 4 different schools, the Palin University sort of credentials. He got in, now he's got, 12 counts of bear poaching on him.
He does.
Cliff Judkins, who's on the board, he was flagged, he and Bob Bell, former member, and Corey Rossi for trying to steal horns.
Muskox
Right.
horns from a subsistence hunt, and the regs say that under a subsistence hunt you can't take the horns, but when they brought him back, they asked the area biologist if they could take them, and he refused.
Right, because he actually knew the rules, and they should have too. So we've got all that. We've got Cora Campbell, who's like, oh, gosh, you know, I didn't know. They said he was being investigated, but I didn't even ask for what. Like, really? The people in charge all the way up.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't see this changing until we change all the way up.
Yeah, and the system is broken, and a lot of people have offered some really great solutions over time, and now it's time to really buckle down and start applying some of those solutions, such as a balanced board. So you have 7 members. Okay, let's make sure one of them represents subsistence.
Right, user groups are all represented.
Yes. And then another idea that I think has a lot of merit is a scientific advisory board. So
Science,
because the board members.
We have a governor that thinks the Earth is 6,000 years old, and the guy in charge of fossil fuels. Where does he think that's from? It's like science. Why do you hate the baby Jesus in the manger, Shannyn? Because you like science. Yeah, science. That would be great if we could apply that.
Yeah, and there's people that are working on that right now, trying to get something like that put in place. But
what are the chances?
Well, they're running up against a wall because the administration doesn't want to apply science. They just want to shoot things from airplanes.
Pray about it, shoot it, sort it out later. I know, it's really nuts. I think that it's time for Alaskans to start talking to their legislators and voting accordingly. And the predator control that we need in this state are the 2-legged predators, not the 4-legged predators, from what I can tell. Thank you so much for being here. We'll be right back with our panel.
All right.
You were great.
Thanks.
Oh my gosh. Welcome back. Welcome back to More Up North and my panel. This is not a flannel convention. No, it isn't. But it feels like it sometimes when we cover these issues. I love it. He's the author of several wildlife books, an international consulting wildlife biologist, and president of WildWatch LLC. Please say hello to Dr. Stephen Stringham. And our next guest, I think, has the perfect voice of a brown bear, in case anybody's needing a voiceover for a film or something. He's a 22-year law enforcement veteran and spent 5 years as a sniper. He's the director of the Alaska Wildlife Alliance, and if bears could talk, they'd sound just like John Toppenberg. And he spent 37 years as a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, specializing in predator-prey relationships all over Alaska. He's now free to speak his mind, thank God. Please welcome Vic Van Ballenberghe. Oh my gosh. I was just thinking about how many years of paying attention to this stuff is sitting up here, and I thank you all very much for being here. It was great to have Valerie here with us, and before we do anything, you have to just do the voice. Please. I love it.
I'm going down the falls and get me some fish.
Thank you for indulging me. I love that. So, this is such a mess. How are we going to fix this in an hour, Vic?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. I've been working on this for a long time, and we've tried a whole bunch of things. You were talking about the initiatives before, and every time an initiative passed, the legislature overturned it, and finally in the final one, they spent $400,000 to defeat it, which they did. We've had a whole slew of court cases over time, and some of them have had short-term victories. We've had boycotts, which you mentioned before, that had success for a while. We've tried citizens planning teams, and we've tried a whole bunch of things, and none of it has really had any lasting effect. And the bottom line is that politics have ruled the day, and the folks that have had the most political juice in recent years have been the people that want just what we have now, which is widespread predator control. And until we get different politicians, I think that's going to be the case for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning, too, that on the last ballot initiative, yes, they spent $400,000. The state did. Sarah Palin sent out like a 27-page glossy, "This is why we're shooting things out of airplanes" pamphlet that was seriously huge. But the other thing was Sean Parnell was in charge of the elections then, and he really manipulated the language on that ballot initiative to the point that I know really smart people that are here in our audience voted the wrong way.
A lot of them.
They voted the wrong way on it because it had just been hinked around.
Right.
Very confusing ballot initiative language. It was astounding.
Yeah, and thanks, Sean Parnell. Go figure on that. What are your thoughts on this giant mess that we're in, Stephen? You've been studying this for a long time.
It's a very complex issue. On the one hand, if you look at the figures that the Board of Game emphasizes throughout this, they're always talking about how many moose or caribou are being killed by predators, or eaten by predators, or however they want to phrase this. And when you look at the statistics they put out, it looks like it's a horrendous number. One of their biologists said that out of every 30,000 moose calves born, only one survives over a year. Most of those are taken by predators.
One out of 30,000?
That's what was said. I don't know
Is this
how
Tea
this
Party
was
math?
directed. Well, what I know is that in the early 70s, when I studied moose on the Kenai Peninsula, I was studying mother-calf relationships. So I was watching the mothers and calves day in and day out. I had 8 calves that I watched the first year, and about that the second year. Not one of those was lost to a predator. So right there, that would account for most of the calves surviving in a year. I don't know how all these figures are derived. Vic has studied this himself, so he's probably the best person to talk about what are normal mortality rates.
Well, let's boil this back a little bit because, we've all seen the, 5,000 wolves can't be wrong, eat moose bumper stickers,
Right.
which I do eat moose. And I don't think any of us are anti-hunting or anything like that or consuming moose up here. But let's boil this back to what we were talking about a little bit in the first segment, which is this animosity towards science.
Well, it's not only towards science, but, I suppose Vic and myself and John, we all own guns, we've all hunted, but I don't think any of us worships a gun, but there is a certain segment where a gun is such a symbol that everything becomes defined in terms of shooting. The solution to all problems is a bullet.
Vic, you want to take on that? The anti-science crowd?
I think there definitely has been a real marked change. I've seen it. I've been involved in this since 1974, and until 2003, when Frank Murkowski first started his campaign against predators, we had science-based management in Alaska. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had qualified leaders, and the department had quite a few good biologists, and there was national recognition that the department had conducted science-based management. When Murkowski was elected, and Palin, who followed, and now Parnell, we have moved far away from science-based management, and it's politically driven management now. Science is so far ahead of management that it's unbelievable.
Right. They're still back on it. Wow, we have these awesome wolves because 2 of them got on an ark. I mean, I'm sorry. It is so far removed from science and reality. I mean, when you hear people like Al Barrett, who was a nominee, skinning out a wolf and quoting from Genesis about dominating the earth, and that in the end days, Alaska will be a refuge for all of the, I should have been raptured, but I wasn't. I was late for the rapture, and so they're going to come to Alaska, and they're going to need moose to eat, and then this ungulate farm. I'm not making this up. This is like part of this philosophy, which is terrifying. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back with our panel and talk about a couple of other issues that have come up just recently and just how insane they are. We'll be right back. Welcome back to More Up North. I know that, Dr. Stringham, you brought some slides that you wanted to share with us with some of the data that you put together. Can you tell me about this chart that you have?
If we're going to interpret mortality figures and other information that we get from the Board of Game, one of the first things we need to do is to understand where the population of moose in any given area like the Kenai Peninsula is relative to its food supply. And when you have a large food supply per individual animal, they're very resistant to predation, disease, weather stresses, etc. So they can be limited by predators because they've got plenty of food. But when food is very scarce out there and you still have a lot of moose, and the food per moose is very low, they tend to be very vulnerable, and sometimes the best thing you need for that population is to have some predation in there if people aren't hunting enough of them to get the population back more in tune with its carrying capacity. Go to the next slide. And when we look at the percent of carrying capacity that a population's at and its sustainable yield, we find when a population's so small, you can't harvest much. As the population gets larger and larger, you can harvest more and more until you reach a point of diminishing returns, after which competition among the moose for food gets to be too much, and they start going down in condition. So when the law says we need to manage for maximum sustained yield, it doesn't mean maximum number we can shoot if we don't have predators. It means how do we look at food supply per capita and see where we get the maximum return relative to the total population size. And that's not the way the Board of Game uses this.
Right, and that is, that basically is the point. It's like you're showing us this, and Vic, it's way more complicated than just bears and wolves. Isn't like this year, for instance, the snow is so deep. In Cordova, the kids are playing on top of the swing set because it's buried. There's so much snow. I've seen the moose in my yard.
The moose are up on the roofs.
Right. They're climbing up on top of garages.
See,
just open your freezer because it might be coming through.
One of the things that I think has happened is that the average hunter in Alaska today thinks that predation is the only factor that limits moose populations. and that's the result of all the attention that's been given to predation by the Game Board, when in fact habitat factors are just as important, if not more so, over the long term. You know, we've got lots of low quality moose habitat in Alaska where if you killed off every last bear and wolf in those areas, you wouldn't produce any more moose. The food supply is just not there to support more moose. And so that's one thing. Secondly, our bad winters like this, you know, we're estimating that there's going to be maybe 2,500 moose that die in the Matsu Valley this winter, and all throughout south central Alaska. So periodic winters come along, and it doesn't matter if you've removed predators, you're going to have a big die-off of moose. And then there's hunting. You know, we've had some populations in Alaska that have been overhunted to the point where they've declined in the past. And so it's you know, we've got to carefully manage hunting as well as predators and other factors. But again, the average hunter, you know, I've talked to a lot of them, and you kind of talk about habitat and you talk about bad winters, you talk about hunting, and when you're all done, they say, yeah, well, that's all true, but really what we have is a predator problem.
The two-legged kind. That's
Well,
not what they're talking about.
They're talking
though.
about four-legged.
Well, you know, John, when you and I have talked about this a few times on the radio program, was the whole McGrath issue, and I've talked to you as well about it, Vic. And let me just boil this down to Homer Girl terms, and you correct me at any point if I am not remembering it correctly. But it seemed as though they went around the area of McGrath. This was some years ago. They said that they were going to have to do predator control. And they wanted to do it in the same area where people could get four-wheelers and ATVs and such. And they were having this giant problem. They said it was the wolf and bears. But there was a real problem with the amount of bulls they had per cows. Now, am I on track so far? Because I think you told me you needed to have 30 bulls per 100 cows. Which means 3 for each of you. Go, Newt Gingrich. He'd love that. So 3 cows per bull is like, that's good times. But in this case, it was down to like 10 or 1, or it was really, really low, wasn't it? Like they were gonna have to dart the bulls with Viagra to like get them to do the job for the cows. But then they said that the wolves and bears were eating all the bulls. It was
false
crazy.
numbers also down there.
It was really, it was
And
super
McGrath.
hinky.
Vic is the real expert on that.
Well, the whole McGrath story is really interesting, and we don't have time to talk about everything, but you know, in the beginning, in 2000, Tony Knowles appointed a team to examine the problem there. And the Department of Fish and Game said that there's 850 moose, they think. They didn't really know because they didn't have any reliable censuses. And the subsistence people said, well, we need 3,500 to meet the subsistence demand in that area. And so you got 850, you need 3,500, let's kill some wolves. Okay, nobody talked about bears. It was all the locals said, we got a wolf problem, and that's as far as it went. Well, they did a reliable census 1 year later, and guess what? 3,600 moose.
Wow.
So they had 4 times as many moose as they thought they had, and the problem kind of went away until Frank Murkowski was elected, and they resurrected it, and they approved a program to reduce predators. Well, first thing they did was transplant a bunch of bears out of the calving grounds, and they doubled moose calf survival for 2 years by doing that. And so suddenly, guess what? There's way more moose than we thought, and it's really not a wolf problem, it's fundamentally a bear problem. And so you would think that we would have learned some lessons there, did we? The main lesson that I took away from that is you need to have some field studies before you approve a predator reduction program, so you know what's actually going on there, how many predators you've got, and whether it's bears or wolves that are causing a problem, if there is a problem.
So it's back to the science thing.
But the Game Board, ever since, and this, again, this is clear back in 2003, when that program was approved, has the Game Board said, well, you know, we really ought to do some field studies before we approve these programs, and we really need to know more than we do? No. They went ahead and they approved 5 other areas for control that weren't that much different in terms of what we knew about what was going on there in the field.
We need to run to a break. There's some newer things that they're trying to introduce, gassing of wolf pups in dens, things that don't make very good. Come to Alaska. We gas our wolf pups and we shoot our bears out of airplanes and helicopters and wolves, and now we're baiting. We're baiting bears now. Yeah, and but only black bears. But if a brown bear shows up, you can shoot it. But you're not baiting the brown ones. I know, it's insane. We'll be right back with more up north. All right, welcome back. Welcome back. I know there's so much to cover, and we're getting to as much of it as we can. But you had another graph that you wanted to show us, Stephen.
Well, what I wanted to mention here is they advanced it. Should go back to the other graph that we had, number 2, but previous one. Anyway, we talk about the anti-science way things are being done with the Board of Game, and one of the problems is that they're doing what we call comic book biology.
Right.
For instance, they say that they want to maximize the sustainable yield, which is up here, but they want to have them at carrying capacity, which is down here, which has no sustainable yield. Not maximum, but minimum sustainable yield, and they don't even know the difference.
Well, you know, I was thinking about this whole thing earlier today, and what it seems that we've lost is that people have dialed out. And I think part of the reason the Alaskans have dialed out of this save the wolves, save the bears kind of conversation is because it's been it's been painted as though it's a bunch of, you know, vegetarian people that live in Berkeley and wear Birkenstocks and listen to Fish, and I mean ones in bowls, not even the band. I mean, that it's been painted that way, that this is outside interests coming in and trying to, you know, save these furry things that eat our food. But I think the truth of it is that outside interests are actually driving the predator control. Outside interests, people that want to come here and get it, they're not putting it in their freezer. They want a great big rack of something to put on their wall, or to get a picture of them like, look, I shot a bull moose. That is who I see driving this more, even though the framing hasn't been able to flip-flop on that. John?
Yeah, basically there's 2 primary organizations in Alaska, the Alaska Outdoor Council and Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife, special interest groups that cater to commercial hunting, trophy hunting. They are the driving force behind much of this. They are controlling much of the politics. They are controlling a lot of legislators. They are having great influence with the Board of Game and the Department of Fish and Game. And they represent a very tiny portion of the hunters here in Alaska. They are screwing up America's last great wildlife Eden, and we're standing by and watching this happen. It's not acceptable.
Whenever, you know, I've been moose hunting. Whenever my friends are out getting moose, I never think like, ooh, how big is it? Because the last thing I want to eat is a 25-year-old cow, you know? I mean, the people that are taking the great big game are the sort of more, you know, Cialis challenged.
They're taking the prime breeding stock, the bulls, the rams in the case of Dall sheep. These are not animals that wolves would take by choice. They're the toughest and the meanest, and wolves are not going to go after them. But these are depleting our wildlife stocks, our genetic reserves, and really destroying the genetic integrity of our moose, our caribou, our Dall sheep. It's not acceptable. If they want to take a cross-section of animals, fine. But if they're going to take out these prime breeding bulls to the point where they diminish our stocks, not acceptable. We got to change it.
What's your take on that, Vic?
Oh, I might have a little bit different perspective. I think the resident hunters in Alaska are the ones that are pretty much driving all this. They're the ones that show up at the game board meeting and testify that You know, there used to be way more moose, and now there's none, and all we see are wolf tracks. So, you know, I think certainly the non-resident hunters play a role, but I think predominantly it's the average hunter here in Alaska that thinks that, by golly, they're entitled to a moose every year, and if they don't get one, we need to kill off a bunch of bears and wolves.
Well,
Yeah.
I agree that that's who's showing up at the Board of Game. And by the way, if you go to a Board of Game meeting, I'm just telling you, it's like, it's horrible. It's horrible to be there, how you're treated as another person who doesn't feel like their gun is an extension of their body. I'm serious. I've never, ever been around people so rude, and I've been around lots of rude people, believe it or not. I mean, it's stunning.
I think the ATV industry and the gun industry are big sources of funding for this too.
Well, maybe so, but you know what? Here's the thing. Most people I know that fill their freezers, they don't go to Board of Game
That's
meetings.
right.
There's no way in hell they'd go. They don't like politics. They want to shoot it. They want to eat it. They want to live. That's their deal, and they don't want to go deal with politics. And in the meantime...
And the folks that represent them on the advisory committees are the ones that have enormous sway with the game board. And you were talking about advisory committees earlier, and certainly, you know, like for example, the Anchorage Advisory Committee. If you could think of any advisory committee in the state that ought to have a diversity of members, including a whole bunch of non-consumptive user folks, you'd be wrong if you thought it was represented by the Anchorage AC. So even though a lot of people don't want to go and be subjected to the board process, the advisory committees show up. They're given more time to testify than the average person, and the makeup of virtually all the advisory committees is about 95% hardcore subsistent or hardcore consumptive users who want to kill predators.
Well, you know, I actually went and voted for my advisory council, right, here in Anchorage. The only thing I think I've ever seen that was the worst sham was the Lake and Penborough vote count that I was at last year on the Pebble Initiative. Seriously, one of the guys who's running, his wife is counting ballots. They hand out pieces of paper, say that you have to stay there through everybody doing their presentations, but they weren't. It was just a piece of paper with lines on it. Anybody could have run to Kinko's. Maybe they did. I don't know. But it was absolutely crazy. Oh, and you didn't have to be from Anchorage to vote in that. They had people from the valley just in droves coming in, voting on who to represent Anchorage. I mean, it's the whole thing broken. Time to start over, throw the lot out, throw the bums out.
One point in relationship to what Vic said, and I think it's very important, I agree with him, whether they're in-state or out-of-state hunters coming up here, going out for a trophy, it is commercial hunting is about dollars and cents. There is a big dollars and cents factor behind all this,
Right.
and it's holding our wildlife and our ecosystems hostage.
Absolutely. We got to run to a break. We're coming back with questions for our panel. All right, welcome back. We've got questions from our audience, and we had a note, from one of our audience members, that all guides aren't horrible trying to screw around with the Board of Game. I don't think anybody said that, but there are, just like any other industry, there are people doing it responsibly, and there are people who are not. The ones who are not happen to have infiltrated hugely. How has Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife infiltrated the ADF&G?
How did they? Well, Corey Rossi was one of the founding board members of Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife, and he was appointed as the Division of Wildlife Conservation Director, as you pointed out earlier, with very limited credentials. And so that organization had a very important person in the Department of Fish and Game as a result.
And that's like at the top level, and it's just gone. I mean, it's in all of they've got all kinds of people there. Are hunters just getting lazy, expecting to get a moose on the first morning of a hunt and back home to watch the game in the afternoon? I think hunting's hard. It is hard. Maybe people are expecting. I mean, it's worth it when you're feeding your family.
Well, it used to be the idea that you wanted to be able to step out of your back door and shoot a moose there, so you didn't have to carry it more than 20 yards, you know.
Right, and people are like, well, those were the good old days. And it's like, yeah, well, you shot all of them out of your backyard. Yep. Maybe that had something to do with it. Are the good biologists at ADF&G being muzzled on predator control by the Parnell Administration? Actually, he's got them in Gitmo right now. I'm kidding.
They're muzzled not only by the administration, but people within the agency. You know, the higher ups on that. There are a lot of people in there who are absolutely pro-predator control.
Vic?
Yeah, I think that the organization now keeps a tight rein on its biologists and what they are allowed to say publicly. And if they don't toe the line, they are reprimanded at best or relieved of their duties at worst. And that's been a change in recent years. I mean, when I worked for the department, it wasn't nearly as tightly run as it is now.
How many years are we away from simply auctioning off our wildlife to wealthy outside hunters, or are we already there?
Alaska now, I think, is moving toward regional game farms. And if we come even close to implementing this situation wherein our wildlife are the possession of people that own land, we will have officially declared Alaska to be a series of regional game farms. And if the state ever gets onto federal land, and this becomes a far more widespread proposition relative to predator control, the whole state's going to become a giant game farm, and a lot of us would like to not see that. The integrity of the living ecosystems would be compromised.
When they did that with elk ranching down in Montana, it was a disaster because there was a lot of disease spread that then went out in the wild population.
Yeah, and they've just been talking recently about having people be able to have the game on their own land to do that here, and it's like, no, Alaska's moose walk on your land, and it's still Alaska's moose. Right. You know, but they're already talking about doing that. What will be the impact of the first video of a bear being killed from a helicopter? I don't know. I think we got a serious tourism boycott coming smack in our face. I mean, you can look at Coney 2012. You can look at all these videos that go viral for different reasons on the internet right now, Facebook, Twitter, etc. That video gets out there, you're going to feel it. And I don't think that people are going to react until, until Walmart's like, we don't have as many RVs this year in our parking lot. And then maybe they'll do something. But I think that would be huge. We got to run to a quick break. We've got way more questions. I'm trying to get through them, I promise. We'll be right back. So much, all of you, for being here at the Taproot with us, for watching at home. We'll try to get through a few of these. How do we get rid of the bums? You have to vote, and you can't vote for people that suck. It's pretty basic. And if everybody on the list sucks, then you need to run. That's how this rolls. In Alaska, you can actually do that. How can we ensure the future commissioners have the education skills to manage wildlife for everyone, other than not voting for Parnell?
We can't, simply because the governor has the power to appoint the commissioner. And even though we can launch a nationwide search for the superintendent of the Anchorage School District, we don't launch national searches for the Commissioner of Fish and Game because the governor wants to appoint somebody that he feels he can control, somebody local, somebody that they know. The last thing they want is somebody that's independent and makes it clear at the outset that they're going to have play a leadership role and get back to science-based management. The governor doesn't want that, and as long as he's the one that has the power to appoint, we're going to continue to have the kind of people we have now.
He's a puppeteer for low-grade puppets.
Yeah. Wow. Where do your guests stay when they're in from out of town? Funny you would ask. They stay at the Copper Whale Inn. They do. We're really grateful for them showing up for our guests. The Copper Whale Inn Bed and Breakfast, located in the heart of Anchorage, downtown. Their West End location, they showed up. This is what happened. I said, we have a guest in from out of town, and they need a place to stay. Who's going to show up? And they did. So thank you very much to them. And you can, if you're traveling into town, look at copperwhale.com. So how can it be legal for the governor to give hunting permits to groups like Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife to use for fundraising? He is?
Do the initials CBC mean anything to you?
Corrupt Bastards Club?
That's the one.
Yeah. So wait, he gave hunting permits, state hunting permits to Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife to use as a fundraiser?
Yes.
Well, I think that's hinky as hell. I really do. I don't know how I didn't know this, but that's our resource, and he's taking it and giving it to a private organization to raffle?
I think I know a way we could restore some trust within ADF&G. If I could just give it a second here. If we could subject their recommendations to manage our wildlife to independent research groups such as the American Society for Mammalogists, National Research Council, let them take a look and make sure they meet good scientific standards. Make sure we are using the best available science. That's exactly the opposite of what we're doing right now.
Yeah, that would be great. Does every Anchorage hunter really need to shoot a moose every year to keep from starving? No. No, they don't. I don't think so.
Well, after you buy a $10,000 ATV, how are you going to afford meat?
Hey, you're onto that. Oh, here's a question. I've heard in Nome one of the biggest predators of moose are ravens. They peck the eyes out of the calves. Have you heard of this?
Might happen once in a blue moon. Doesn't happen on a regular basis.
I would have suspected the magpies. I would have.
Hummingbirds.
God, they're vicious magpies. Magpies will eat magpies. I just have a whole new thought about them. Why was Cliff Judkins chair of the Board of Game subsistence hunting on Nunivak for muskox?
Yeah, really.
Perfectly legal. It's the way the regulations are set up that in Alaska, everybody is a subsistence hunter. You don't have to be a rural resident. You can be making $1 million a year and live in a $5 million home and own a whole fleet of airplanes and ATVs, and you're on the same basis as a subsistence hunter than somebody living in the bush who doesn't make anything in terms of cash.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like the best use of our resources. Thank you guys so much for being here. This is a really complicated issue, and you know, for someone who grew up enjoying hunting and fishing and trapping and all of that, there's just a really big damn difference between killing stuff and actually hunting. A very big difference, and I think Alaskans need to remember that. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for all of you, and we'll be back next week with more Up North.